Welcome back to another episode of Justification. Good morning to you. Blessed morning to you. Whatever struggle you're going through, know that it's for a purpose, and that despite the roadblock you may be experiencing, or even the joy, the gratitude, the simplicity that you may be experiencing, know that it is all for a reason to take you to a greater point of simplicity, a greater point of justice, interesting word to use, and a greater point of understanding who you are and what the living God has for you. So whatever you are going through or believe you are not going through, celebrate it one day at a time, as difficult as it may be, and take care of not just your physical self, but also what is within. Each potential roadblock is to draw us nearer not to ourself, but to our Creator, and to understanding that we are a creation. And I believe that that's a definite transition to where we need to be this morning, and to pick up where we last left off, which I can understand there is a lot of questions or thoughts, because we've been diving into subjects that are not popular or have not been, spoken in such a way, and dealing with terms and definitions and context and illustrations. There's a lot to take in, and especially the note that we last left off on, which was a note on the definition of sin, or the idea of sin. And so this episode, this meeting, we will talk about, and who knows how long this will continue, because it fits into the definition of justification in its right context. So we will be talking about the definition of sin. We will be looking at sin and where it came from, at least for the time being. Now, usually I like to go to the Bible to find out where terms come from and how they can be understood and rationalized and explained and meditated on and investigated. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start by showing what sin is according to what we know. What we know sin is. And I'm not even going to do any research for it. We can just basically just talk. We can talk about what sin is. When we think about the definition of sin, we think about physical wrong, physical error, resulting from some sort of mental lapse or some sort of mental character defect, some sort of inward defect, leading us to go astray in a moral sense physically. So when we think about sin, we think about a deviation, yes, from God, but we also think about a more than a moral deviation from God, in the sense of us losing ourselves to ourselves in doing acts that are, quote unquote, not decent to the divine eye. And so let that be what it will be, I guess, as a basis of what the definition of sin is. I'm sure you have your own definition of what sin is, and what I'm saying may not be far off from it. And so where does that come from, right? That's what I'm getting at. So we may have whatever definition we have of sin, its foundation or its root may be similar and of the same, form. But where does the general idea that we today know in our religious tradition, not even in our religious tradition, in our automatic thought of what sin is, where does that come from? How do we have it? Who gave it to us? Because just like Adam was asked in the garden, right? Who told you were naked? Yeah, who told you were naked? Because I didn't. So how do you know that there's something wrong with you? How do we know that there is a thing called sin that exists, and that this thing called sin that exists in the context that we hold it in? How do we know? Where does it come from? This is what we are going to discuss in our time together. So the idea behind what we know to be original sin, the philosophy behind it, comes from an individual way back, from Augustine of Hippo. Hopefully I said that right. Augustine of Hippo, which lived around the time of 350 to 450, I'll just say AD. 350 to 450 AD. Augustine of Hippo is the one that coined this concept or philosophy, and it was later accepted into the Christian religion as concrete, or as what to define sin as, and every sort of concept related to sin as, therefore, or therefore. So Augustine of Hippo, at this juncture, in the time period that he lived in, is the individual that coined what we know to be original sin. Now, just simple, we understand, or may understand, original sin to begin with, Adam and Eve, and we are therefore naturally born wrong to ourselves, wrong toward God, primarily, firstly, because we have inherited this disease from our first parents. Now, this concept, though changed over the years, originally began with Augustine of Hippo, who, elaborating on this idea of original sin, stated that the error in Adam and Eve passes down generation to generation to generation to generation through sexual intercourse. So it is through sexual intercourse that sin travels, beginning with Adam and then Eve, and then the sexual intercourse those two had, that intercourse and the error that they committed, it transfers generation to generation to the next through sexual intercourse. And the more lewd the sexual intercourse, the more lewd, the greater the sin or the error that is transmitted. So when it comes to the foundational doctrine of sin, of original sin, I'll say foundational because it has to do with what our present theological opinion of sin is. This is what it's based off of. It's based off of the philosophy of this individual who biologically links sin to us. So sin is biological. A bit of background about this individual before he transitioned into the then popular religion of the Jew that called themselves Christian, is that this individual, before taking on this new religion, was involved with Neoplatonism. So this was his religion before accepting the religion of the Jew, which was being called Christian, new form of religion. It was a Neoplatonist. Neoplatonism has to do with many types of philosophies in there, but trying to keep it simple, an example is that it has to do with the soul, and the soul reaching its way back to what is called the eternal or the supreme deity. So what you can mix and figure into that, Neoplatonism has to do with all of that and a lot more. Before getting involved with Neoplatonism, he had a religious belief prior to that. This religious belief was the Manichaean faith. Now, the Manichaean faith is a faith that, of course, many principles are involved in this, but a key principle was the philosophy or the teaching of a battle between good and evil, or how original evil existed and counterparts original good. The original good, although being omnipotent, not so omnipotent because it has an opposing force. So what I'm getting at is the philosophy of this individual that coined original sin has a context of thought that goes into what he's then crafting and into what the Christian church accepts as pure doctrine. So mixed into this belief of original sin is Neoplatonism and also many other sorts of teachings that relate not to the context that the Bible would have it, but to a natural biological way of thought. And this is important for the direction that we're going when it comes to the definition of sin. Now, when it comes to, because Augustine of Hippo did not, get this from anywhere. Of course, his beliefs are definitely built and structured around past pagan religious philosophy and theology. But when it comes to the concept of sin, the number one individual that is quoted as a base of understanding is Paul. So when we go to the book of Romans chapter 5, verses 12 to 14, the book of Romans chapter 5, verses 12 to 14, we read, and Paul writes, "Whereas by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin. And so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed when there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses," which is key. This is key. "Even over them that had not sinned after the similitude of Adam's transgression, who was the figure of him that was to come." Now, Paul is describing how sin began. Paul is describing the context of sin, and grasping the context of what Paul is saying is important. Because if we're not grasping the context, we're going to take what Paul is saying the same way that Augustine of Hippo took it. Now, a question that we need to ask, and it's a simple question, a question that we need to ask concerning the definition of sin, the sin that Paul is talking about. If we can answer this question, we can understand the context or the idea behind what Paul is saying. Now, the question is, did Adam literally die? That's the question. Did Adam literally die? Because wherefore, Romans 5, verse 12, "Wherefore as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin." Now, did Adam literally die by sinning? The answer is no. The fact that Adam did not literally or physically die by quote-unquote sin lets us know that the sin within the Bible is not to be defined biologically. Right? You see how cool that is? The fact that there was no physical death. Now, the point of getting Adam to sin was because the serpent, we're sticking to the story, the serpent believed that God said, "If you do this, you will die," and so God cannot lie. If I can get him to do this, God will kill him. So the serpent did what the serpent did and manipulated how he would manipulate, and Adam fulfilled the manipulation to a T. But to the serpent's surprise, Adam did not physically drop. He did not physically die. The sin that Adam was to commit was not physical. Therefore, his death should not be physical. Therefore, sin should not be categorized initially or primarily as a physical thing. Now that's interesting, because then it brings up another question. What is the death that Adam suffered by sin? If he did not die physically, but yet the Bible will let us know that Adam died, and that the same death that Adam died would be passed down, what is the death that Adam took on? We find an example in the book of Psalm 13 and verse 3. Psalm 13 and verse 3. Psalm 13 and verse 3 says, "Consider and hear me, O Lord my God. Lighten mine eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of" what? "Lighten mine eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death." The death Adam suffered, it was a sleep to the eyes, not literal, to the eyes. Now, if you recall in our meetings, in our previous meetings, we've gone through this, and we've seen how the Bible defines the eyes. In context, in right context of language, the Bible is not talking about the literal eyes, because Adam was not literally blind. His sin did not literally blind him. His transgression or his defiance of the living God's commandment did not literally blind him. What happened to Adam's eyes? Because it says, "Lighten mine eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death." This was the death that Adam was assigned. Turning to the book of Isaiah chapter 44. Turning to the book of Isaiah 44 and verse 18. Isaiah 44 and verse 18. Isaiah 44 and verse 18 reads, "They have not known nor understood. For he hath shut their eyes that they cannot see," and this is the key, "and their hearts that they cannot understand." The death that Adam suffered was not a physical death, but a mental death, a spiritual death, a death to his devotional conscience and culture. The death that was promised to Adam was a death in spiritually understanding the living God's devotional character. What was passed down from generation to generation, Augustine had it right, but not so much, because it's not biological that the Bible is talking about. It was mental and it was spiritual. Adam's error opened up a spiritual religious tradition that continually violated the living God's name. This is what passed down from generation to generation. There's nothing biological. It was mental, it was spiritual, it was devotional, it was philosophical. The philosophy concerning the living God was tarnished. Generation to generation to generation continued to tarnish it. And then that's why Paul brings in Moses. Paul brings in Moses because without Moses, that tarnishing continued. But due to the entrance of Moses, sin became defined. Why? Sin became defined because Moses brought in the concept of the philosophy of the religious law. The concept of the philosophy of the religious law gave to the congregation an idea and a standard and a script on how to define transgression against God. So when once Moses entered onto the scene of action, Moses brought in the balm of the death to the understanding. And Paul tells us this in the book of Romans chapter 3 and verse 20, the end of that verse. Romans chapter 3 and verse 20. Romans chapter 3 and verse 20 says, "By the law is the knowledge of sin." Without the philosophy of the religious law, there was no knowledge of sin. Knowledge of sin awoke due to the possessing, due to the entrance, due to the giving, due to the inheriting of the religious law and its philosophy as given by Moses, because the congregation now knew what to do and what not to do concerning the rite, ritual, and belief of the God of the congregation. So again, sin to the Bible is not biological. There's nothing biological. Call it something else. Call it something else. But what is passed down is not biological. It is theological. The sin passed down is theological. And this can be proven in the book of Isaiah 59. Isaiah 59, 13 and 14 speaks about this error in mind. Isaiah chapter 59, verses 13 and 14. Isaiah 59, verses 13 and 14. Let's give it a brief verse, just a brief verse. Isaiah 59, verses 13 and 14. In transgression and lying against the Lord, and departing away from our God, speaking oppression and revolt, conceiving and uttering from the heart words of falsehood. And judgment is turned away backward, and justice standeth afar off. For truth is fallen in the street, and equity cannot enter. This is the sin that Adam brought in and passed down. And we know this because it is also magnified a couple chapters down from when this event took place. Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6, verses 11 and 12. It was not biological warfare that entered into existence, that already existed. What entered into existence was spiritual, philosophical, and devotional warfare into the assembly calling themselves of Eden, which was of the living God. This warfare, this conflict, and this controversy passed down not biologically. At some point, maybe. Primarily, spiritually, devotionally, philosophically, this passed down. And continues. That's why there's a difference between what is in the Bible and what is popular or modern theological thought. It was Adam that brought in popular modern theological thought. And generation came, generation went. Generation arrived, generation left. What came and went with it was a doctrine or philosophy greatly violating the living God from the one previous to it. And so with violation after violation, after generation, this is what we have passed down to us, and this is what we see at this point in time. The language within the Bible is different from what we know. And I can promise you that this will all tie in. This will all tie into the cap of justification. Because this is the point of what to be justified from and the reason behind desiring justification according to the Bible. Genesis chapter 6 and verse 11 and 12. Genesis chapter 6 verse 11 and 12, it reads, "The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with" what? Now this violence, this corruption, is the sin that Adam brought in. God looked upon the earth in verse 12, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. The entrance of the Bible definition of sin into the atmosphere shook every foundation related to the living God's devotional character. This was not biological, this was devotional, this was philosophical, this was spiritual, this was theological. What was the violence? What was the violence that Adam brought in? That the Bible is stating here in the book of Genesis. What was that violence? Psalm 119 verse 126. Psalm 119 verse 126, it reads, "It is time for the Lord to work, for they have made void thy law." The violence was against the law of the living God. Or, better word, the philosophy of the living God. Again, Isaiah 24 and verse 5. Isaiah 24 and verse 5, "The earth also is defiled under the inhabitants thereof, because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, broken the everlasting covenant." The violence was against the living God's covenant, philosophy, testimony, will, doctrine. This was the sin that Adam brought in, which was a lacking of understanding that testimony or doctrine, which gave birth to this violence. The blocking of his mind gave birth to this violence. Again, the book of Zephaniah. Zephaniah chapter 3 and verse 4, this is clear. This is clear. Zephaniah chapter 3 and verse 4, her prophets are light and treacherous persons. Her priests have polluted the sanctuary. They have done violence to what? This is what took place in the book of Genesis that required or even demanded, according to God's eye, a flood. They have done violence to the law of the living God's name. Micah. The book of Micah chapter 3 and verse 11. The book of Micah chapter 3 and verse 11. The heads thereof judge for reward. 1. The priests thereof teach for hire. 2. And the prophets thereof divine for money. 3. Yet will they lean upon the Lord and say, is not the Lord among us? None evil can come from us. These are the points of error that, from the blocking of this one individual's mind in perceiving the living God's devotional character, these are the points that entered into the realm of thought concerning the living God. By one individual, yes, sin entered. But according to the Bible, what entered was not biological. You may say that it was biologically framed to the philosophy within the Bible. You could say that, but it was not biological according to the human being. What entered was devotional, philosophical, theological error. Violence to the living God's philosophy due to a slumbering of the mind to perceive that philosophy is what entered and is what continued. And then according to Paul, this stopped because Moses brought in a new philosophy to shed light on the wrong that was being committed. This is the dispute. I'm not giving the full dispute, and I'm not quoting Paul, the rest of those verses. I'm just giving the dispute, the initial dispute over sin. Its definition is not what we take it as for the culture war tradition. And the Bible, according to the Bible, it says so.